The gas gauge blinked red like a warning light in my brain, and the engine gave a sputtering cough, one last exhausted breath, before dying completely. Just like that, I was coasting in silence, the road stretching endlessly into the night. Nothing but darkness in my rearview mirror, and the cold gleam of the moon above. God damn it. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white. My foot tapped uselessly at the gas pedal, but the car didn't so much as groan in response. Dead as a doornail. The highway had been a ghost town for miles. Nothing but skeletal trees and the occasional abandoned-looking farmhouse. My last call had been to my mum, just over an hour ago, letting her know I was making good time on the drive home. Now, as I pulled my phone from the passenger seat, I stared at the empty signal bars. No service. Of course. I sighed, resting my forehead against the steering wheel. I should have stopped for gas in the last town, but the idea of sitting in another dingy station, sipping stale coffee, had been unappealing. My stomach grumbled in protest. I hadn't eaten since lunch. A flickering neon glow in the distance caught my eye. I squinted through the windshield. A sign, swaying slightly in the night breeze, hung on rusted chains over a small, squat building just off the road. Earl's Diner, open late. Not exactly the Ritz, but it was something. Maybe they had a phone, or at the very least, someone who could tell me where the hell I could find a gas station or a mechanic in the morning. I grabbed my coat from the back seat and stepped out into the night. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like rust. I shook off the thought and started towards the diner. The inside of Earl's Diner was a time capsule from the 1950s. Checkerboard floors scuffed to hell, vinyl booths with duct tape holding together the seams, a long counter lined with red-topped stools. The walls were yellowed with age, covered in framed photos of smiling families that looked like they belonged in an entirely different world than this one. A single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping a coffee cup with a rag that looked dirtier than the cup itself. Her uniform was pale blue, a white apron tied tight around her waist, blonde hair piled up in a lazy beehive. Her face was hollow-cheeked and sharp, her lipstick a garish red smear. "Help you, hun?" she asked, voice husky, like she'd smoked a pack before I walked in. "My car died a couple of miles back," I said, stuffing my hands into my pockets. "No phone service out there. You got a landline I can use?" She eyed me for a moment, then shook her head. "Phone's busted. Been busted for weeks." I frowned. "You know anywhere I can get a mechanic? Maybe someone I can call in the morning?" She sucked her teeth and glanced towards the kitchen door. "You'll want to talk to Earl. He's in the back." "All right. Mind if I wait here?" She shrugged. "Suit yourself." I slid onto a stool, feeling the cracked vinyl groan beneath me. The air smelled like burnt grease and something else. Something sweet, like spoiled meat left too long in the sun. I tried not to gag. A man sat in the farthest booth, half shrouded in shadow. He wore a threadbare flannel, his face hidden behind a newspaper. Something about him, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, startling me. Sure." She turned, pouring a stream of dark liquid from an old steel pot into a chipped ceramic cup. The coffee smelled bitter, strong enough to peel paint from the walls. I took a sip, wincing. The door to the kitchen swung open, and a man emerged. Thick around the middle, arms like tree trunks, wearing a greasy white undershirt. His face was ruddy, round, but his eyes were sharp, like a butcher sizing up his next cut. "You the fellow with the car trouble?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, standing. "You Earl?" "That's me." He wiped his hands on a stained dish towel. "Ain't much of a mechanic, but I know a guy. He don't work nights though. Best you can do is wait till morning." I glanced at the window. The night stretched on, endless and black. The idea of sleeping in my car didn't sit well with me. "Any motels nearby?" Earl chuckled, shaking his head. "Closest one's a good 20 miles out. Not much out here but trees and road." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "Guess I'll wait here for a bit." Earl and the waitress exchanged a glance. Something quick and unreadable. "Well," Earl said, "if you're staying a while, might as well eat something. Best burger in town." It wasn't like I had many options. My stomach was already tying itself in knots. "Yeah, all right, I'll take a burger." "Good choice," Earl grinned, showing teeth that were a little too white, a little too even. "Maggie'll fix you up." The waitress, Maggie, smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She turned and disappeared into the kitchen. I glanced at the man in the corner booth. He hadn't moved, hadn't even turned the page of his paper. His stillness was unnerving. The wind howled outside, rattling the diner's windows. The coffee sat in my stomach like a stone. Something wasn't right here. I just didn't know what. Not yet. The atmosphere in the diner was like something straight out of a 50s movie, but it felt warped somehow. I can't quite describe it, but something felt off. An old jukebox in the corner droned out some doo-wop tune, warbling like it was being played underwater. I was trying to think of any other way out of this. I was effectively stranded. My car was a mile or so back. Not that it'd be much use anyway. I tried to ignore the inner voice screaming in my head to get out, but it wasn't working. The jukebox spluttered and skipped, the doo-wop tune distorting, like something chewing at the edges of reality. Cutting through the bizarre trill of the jukebox, the sound of a sizzling grill filled the diner. Something about the smell was wrong. It wasn't just meat and grease. It was something bitter, something acrid. My mouth filled with the taste of copper. I turned to look at the man in the booth. He was bathed in shadow, but for the first time, I really saw his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His lips were cracked. But his eyes, God, his eyes were the worst part. They weren't eyes at all, just empty sockets, dark as the space between stars. I must have been seeing things, illusions brought on by stress and hunger. Delusion is a powerful thing. snapping me out of my trance as I stared at the strange man in the booth. The burger arrived on a chipped white plate, grease pooling around the edges of the bun. The meat was thick, pink in places where it should have been brown. The smell was off, like it had been sitting out for too long, just on the cusp of turning rancid. But my stomach was empty, and the hunger gnawed at me like an impatient dog. Maggie stood by the counter, watching. Earl leaned against the register, arms crossed over his chest. The man in the booth still hadn't moved, hadn't looked up from his newspaper. The air in the diner felt heavy, pressing down like a thick, invisible fog. I picked up the burger, hesitated, but then took a bite. The taste hit me like a slap. Iron-rich, a little too chewy. Something stringy caught between my teeth. My stomach turned as I chewed, my brain working hard to ignore the warning bells going off inside my head. "That good, huh?" Earl grinned, eyes sharp with something close to amusement. I swallowed hard, forcing the meat down. My tongue felt coated, and my throat felt tight. My pulse thumped in my ears. And then, from the back of the diner, a muffled sound. A voice. A cry. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, someone was screaming. It was muffled, yes, but it was unmistakably human. I dropped the burger onto the ground. My hands were slick with grease, or maybe something worse. Earl and Maggie weren't watching me anymore. They were watching the kitchen door, their bodies rigid, their expressions unreadable. The man in the booth finally moved. He set his newspaper down, revealing a gaunt face with deep-set eyes that glisten under the flickering fluorescent lights. His mouth twitched upward in something that might have been a smile or a sneer. "You should leave," he muttered. My breath hitched. What the hell's going on here? Earl took a slow step forward, reaching into his apron pocket. I glimpsed the dull glint of metal, a knife maybe. Maggie's hands were clenched tight around the edge of the counter, her knuckles bone white. The scream came again, louder this time. I snapped into motion, pushing back from the stool so fast that it clattered to the ground. I turned and sprinted for the door. Something heavy crashed behind me, a plate maybe. Then came the unmistakable sound of boots pounding against tile. I lunged at the door and yanked it open, the cold night air slamming into me. But before I could make it outside, a hand clamped around my wrist like an iron vice. Now, Earl murmured, his breath hot against my ear. Ain't polite to leave before dessert. I twisted, yanking myself free, just as something whistled past my face. A knife, gleaming under the sickly yellow lights. It hit the door frame with a dull thunk. I tried to reach the back of the diner. If there was someone in that kitchen, someone alive, I had to help them. I burst through the swinging doors, heart hammering, and stopped dead. A row of metal hooks lined the back wall. On them, limp and pale under the harsh kitchen lights, hung bodies. Not cows, not pigs. People. My stomach turned inside out. One of them, a man, young, maybe early 20s, was still moving. His eyes rolled towards me, lips parting in a soundless plea. The sound of footsteps behind me snapped me back to reality. Earl and Maggie were coming. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy rusted meat cleaver, and turned just as Earl burst through the door, grinning like a wolf. The next few seconds were a blur. The cleaver came down. Earl howled, staggering back, blood spilling over his white undershirt. Maggie screamed. I pushed past them, running, barely aware of my own breath. I can't tell you what was in that diner when I rushed through. I was just focused on survival. I had to get out. The man in the booth was just sitting there, not reacting. He just watched as I tore out of the front door and into the night. I didn't stop running. Not until I saw headlights in the distance. A truck, a real living person behind the wheel. I waved them down, collapsing onto the road as they skidded to a stop. "Help," I croaked. "Please." The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked over my shoulder towards the diner and then back at me. "Jesus," he muttered. "You actually got out." I blinked at him, dazed, shaking. "What?" But he didn't answer. He just reached over, threw open the passenger door, and gestured for me to get in. I hesitated, just for a second. Then, behind me, I heard the diner door creak open. And I didn't wait to see who or what was coming after me. All I remember from then on is the sound of rubber screeching on asphalt as a wave of relief washed over me. You see, as I feared that I would be next. For more terrifying creepypasta horror stories, check out the playlist or the video on screen.